Welcome back to the Scripture Lounge. Again, it's wonderful to have the Reverend Dr. John Cater with us as we reflect on the readings for what is traditionally called Low Sunday. Why do you think it's called Low Sunday?
Because I think most people, especially people who've spent the last week in church, probably are feeling fairly low.
It's been a tough haul.
It's been a tough haul. A very different kind of haul this year than most years. Who would have thought you could go to church so much without ever leaving your house?
That's right. That's right. There's so many options out there too.
I know it.
Float around.
Yeah.
And use whatever you want, whenever you want.
Right.
So.
And dressed however you want.
Dressed however you want. Exactly.
And sitting wherever you want.
Well, this is an interesting week liturgically in that, I personally think that Low Sunday, haven't really studied it in detail, is really something that resulted from much later in history, where we put so much ritual and high celebration into the meaning of a week or two, and then everything seemed low after that. But in real time, in the resurrection, they were far from celebrating. I think there was a lot of confusion, a lot of questioning, a lot of struggle going on. And I think one of those we can see today in the reading for the gospel for Low Sunday.
I think you're absolutely right, and we need to notice that the setting, as John tells it, because the disciples are still locked in. They haven't ventured out. They've got the doors all locked. Presumably, they're all kind of huddled together. Obviously not all of them, because Thomas is missing, but. They couldn't have been more surprised when the risen Christ appears to them, and suddenly there they are.
Scared,
still wondering what on earth is going on. And that's something that just runs through all these Easter stories. I don't think there's ever been an Easter for me where the sense of fear that obviously is around the Easter story, both before and immediately afterward, has been so real, because pretty much everybody in the world is scared right now. And we were just as scared as the disciples were in different ways, and we were all locked in. I mean, most of us are still locked in. And the reason we're locked in is not so much because somebody's told us to be locked in. It's mostly because we're scared to go outside. And that's exactly
a lot of relevance there.
Yeah. And I always want to know why the people who wrote the Gospels put in the stories that they put in. We've talked some before about what's left out, but as this morning's gospel points out, there are lots of stories circulating that the author didn't put in. So you have to ask, well, why this story and not some other story? And I think probably there are maybe two reasons, and one is more obvious than the other, and that is that doubt is something that happens to people. Doubt is part of the Christian life. I don't think there's a single person alive that has not at some point asked themselves, is this all true? Is there anything here? Does this make any sense? Am I wasting my time? Should I sit at home reading the Sunday paper instead of getting out and dragging myself out to church? Who am I kidding? I don't think there's a single person who identifies themselves as a Christian who hasn't experienced that. And I don't think it's just something that people in the 21st century experience. I think first century people certainly experienced it. Probably most Jews in the first century expected that there would be some kind of resurrection, because they couldn't believe that God would let the bad guys get away with what they got away with without getting punished and without rewarding the people who had suffered from them. And so most, certainly not most, but many Jews in the first century, the Pharisees anyway, believed that, yeah, there was going to be a resurrection, but not today, not tomorrow, but at the end of time, when God finally has enough of what's going on down here on earth and brings it all to an end, and then does the big sheep-goat separation, and the people who have suffered for their faith are raised to glory, and the people who have persecuted them are raised to what they wish they didn't have to face. So resurrection wasn't a new idea. What nobody was expecting is that somebody would be raised from the dead here and now. And I think first century people had just as much trouble with Easter as 21st century people, because it was completely outside, not only outside their experience, but outside their expectation, outside their hope. Don't talk about resurrection on a Sunday morning. Talk about resurrection at the end of time, when the Messiah throws over the Roman Empire and fixes things. And so I don't think anybody really expected that they would experience something that we call resurrection on Easter morning. And so as what I remember reading a German theologian back when I was in graduate school called Jürgen Moltmann, and Moltmann addresses the fact that nobody had ever been raised from the dead before, and whether that means that we shouldn't pay too much attention to it or not. And Moltmann said, and I think he's right, just because something has never happened, don't think it can't happen. But you know, we all do. It can never happen. Well, sometimes it does.
And why do people focus on it, happening somewhere else at some other time, when the real issue is it happening in your life? Is it happening right now? And so I'm going to be starting a preaching series through Easter. I love the idea that Easter is a season, and there was once a theologian who said, we have a thing called the Stations of the Cross, where I suppose the church's idea was we really need to spend more time understanding the suffering of Christ and the stages of his sacrifice to us. But why do we not have the stations of the resurrection? In other words, why are we not taking time to really understand that resurrection is not a Sunday morning party for something that happened we may not believe in, but rather that it is the initiation of a process of incorporation that approaches us in unique and different ways. And I wonder, like for Thomas had his own resurrection experience. It wasn't like any other disciple's experience. And I would imagine all of us have to find our way to the joy, to the freedom, to the justice, to the things that we are here for. And in this case, there's something interesting that happens. He's invited to put his fingers into the wounds of Christ. Right. And I'm thinking about how many of us, how many people across the planet right now are feeling the need to connect with the fact that God is wounded and that we're not being punished. We are wounded, and that God is present in those wounds. I think for many, that could be an avenue, that could be a station of the resurrection.
I think that's a very, very powerful way to put it. And I think the idea of stations of the resurrection is wonderful. That I think the stations of the cross kind of give people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time the chance to kind of make a pilgrimage through the last day of Jesus' life on earth. And in a way, stations of Easter, stations of the resurrection is a different kind of pilgrimage. It's a kind of pilgrimage to places where people do in fact find God, including places where we have to look at and maybe even touch the very wounds.
You think that we don't have a lot of detail in many of the disciples' cases, but you wonder when the real power got going. Like they weren't waiting around for an emperor to become a Christian for 3 centuries later to get things going. They were facing a threat, and it wasn't under easy circumstances that this incredible message, which apparently could be summarized by referring to it as good news, took off and started transforming people's lives. And how do you imagine that taking shape with all these disciples questioning each other and not getting along and saying, I don't believe you, or show me, or I'm sure it must have been a bit of a process.
I think it was, and I think there's some hints of that in the New Testament, and I'm thinking especially of the Pentecost story. Paul, when he's listing the Easter stories that he'd heard, Paul mentions that Christ appeared to more than 500 people at once. Now, there's no mention of that story in the Gospels. But what there is a mention of in Luke's Gospel, well, not in Luke's Gospel, but in Volume 2, which is the book of the Acts, is the experience of Pentecost. And it seems to me, and I didn't think this up by myself, but it seems to me that really what Luke is describing 50 years later as Pentecost is really much more an Easter experience where the followers of Jesus together somehow get a sense that God's power is still there, that what they felt in Jesus' presence is still with them. Because that's what Pentecost really is. The spirit that enervates Jesus is the spirit that enervates the whole church, the whole community, and so I think at least in retrospect, looking back, Luke sees that Pentecost experience as the kind of culmination of Easter when people finally get it and say, oh, it's not the same, he's not still here, and yet he is still here because we're still here. We're together. And that's the other thing about this interesting story that John has us for tomorrow, for Sunday. And that is that the disciples are together when the risen Christ makes his appearance, and he says something which I think is quite remarkable. He says, if you forgive somebody their sins, they're forgiven, and if you don't forgive somebody their sins, they're retained. They're not forgiven. I remember when I was a student at the General Theological Seminary, that phrase was in gold lettering around the walls of the seminary chapel, not in English, but in Latin, which says a whole lot about General Seminary and when it was built and what people were thinking about priests. Whoever sins, you would forgive, they're forgiven. Whoever sins, they retain, you retain, they're retained. And of course, the church as an institution has said, well, that simply gives the clergy the right to forgive sins or not, as if somehow we had become God. I think that's probably a little overreaching what the story says, but I think there's a profound truth in that story, and I think it really makes sense in what we're talking about today, and that is the community, because that's who the risen Christ is speaking to. The community of followers is the community where people experience or don't experience God and the forgiveness of God. And if the community is full of hate and rancor and violence and distrust, then people who are part of the community, people who come into contact with that community, are not going to feel loved, they're not going to feel forgiven, they're not going to feel accepted. But if the community says, come on in, that's the way that we individuals, we human beings, find out that God is real, and that resurrection is real, and that life is possible. And I think one of Thomas's complaints is he didn't feel like he was part of the group. He felt like an outsider. You know, what is this? Everybody else has this wonderful experience of togetherness and comfort and presence with the living Christ. And I didn't have any of that. I didn't get any of that. And so it's only when he's with the community that he finds his Easter.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put. I'm thinking too of how how we are so disembodied now as a church. It's hard to feel that connection with each other. And we see that funny Zoom that's been going around of Jesus sitting at the table by himself at the Last Supper and Zooming with his disciples. And then also, on another serious note of people, priests even, who cannot be with the dying physically right now. And I think some places are lifting that, or they're allowing family to come in at the very end. But how do you see us as a church during this time when we are so disembodied, if you will? We don't have that put your fingers in the wounds here kind of feeling, where you can really be with somebody who can understand your suffering. You can feel their presence in a special way.
One of the things that has just struck me much more than I would have ever dreamed is how powerful community can be, even when we're not physically together. I have experienced remarkable closeness with people literally all over the world by doing what we're doing. I mean, I'm in Hong Kong and you're in Oakland, and that's a pretty big difference. And yet we see each other, we talk to each other, we communicate with each other, and I think one of the things that it's done for me, and I think for a whole lot of people, and again, I wish I could say that I think these things up by myself. I don't. I just listen to what other people say, and I think, yeah, that's right. But particularly the Bishop of Virginia, in her messages to the clergy, has been really emphasizing the power of the word, and maybe we in a world where we're so busy all the time and we're moving around all the time, maybe sometimes we forget that words are words have their own reality and words have their own power. I think we get that sometimes when people say cutting things to each other, cruel things to each other, and we realize that I mean, you can do it over the telephone. You don't even have to be face to face to insult somebody. And we realize that in those moments we realize, wow, words can really hurt. On the other hand, words can also really comfort. So I think our ancestors understood that a lot better than we did. The storyteller in Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, God speaks and things happen. Words have power. Words have presence. And so, I wish more than I can tell you that I was at St. John's in Oakland this Sunday, hanging out with the people that I love. But we're not totally disconnected because words matter. Words have their own kind of presence. So I've just been so struck by how connected it's possible to be, even when you're literally on the other side of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's nicely put. I think that I was reading some article somebody gave me. It compared a lot of what priests do as portal work. That the Eucharist or the table is kind of a portal, or like prayer is a portal into some other level or space. And they were arguing that helping people learn Zoom is a way to help create portals into other spaces, other environments, other experiences. And I was really moved by that. But I think it has a lot to do with what you said, which is the words that you bring through that portal and the way you invite people into that portal. And makes all the difference.
And apparently one of the phenomena, and this may have to do with the fact that you don't have to get dressed up and you maybe don't even have to get out of bed, but apparently in many cases, church attendance, cyber attendance is higher than regular Sunday attendance. People find that, especially if you're stuck in your house all the time, it's really important to be in community, and they're doing it. There was one, I may have mentioned this before, the bishop reported that a congregation in Virginia that ordinarily has about 40 people in church on Sunday is regularly getting over 150 people every Sunday. So I think we might even want to think about the place of Zoom in parish revitalization.
You're right. I think we need to really listen to what's happening right now and open our minds to what's possible. Well, John, again, thank you so much for reflecting on Thomas with us this morning, and that amazing story. And I don't know what the proper greeting is. Happy Low Sunday, or
Happy Low Sunday.
Happy Low Sunday.
Suitably low.
Don't get too low.
Don't get too low.
It's always good to see you and connect with you, and I look forward to doing this again.
So do I. Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care now.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.